Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Artist and Studio Manager here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located in Piscataway and Susquehannock Land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Leigh Taylor Mickelson. Leigh is a resident of Ossining, New York, is an artist and independent consultant with 24 years of experience in nonprofit arts management and program development. Her ceramic sculpture is inspired by forms from nature, especially ones found in plant life as a means of expressing narratives about life. Being full of dichotomy, the elements of natural forms act as a metaphor for the spiritual, emotional, and physical extremes that exist within ourselves, our love relationships, and our family units. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Studio Art and English Literature from Hamilton College and received her MFA in Ceramic Sculpture from Rochester Institute of Technology School for American Crafts. Mickelson has had several articles published in various publications and catalogs, has taught ceramics and workshops across the East Coast, and exhibits her own work widely across the nation. She started her consulting business, LTM Arts Consulting, in 2019 after 22 years of experience in program development and nonprofit arts management with 2 art nonprofits. She is thrilled to have the opportunity to bring her perspective and skills to other businesses and nonprofits who are looking to increase their impact and vibrancy in the community. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. Tune in for our next artist talk on Tuesday, January 14th with Carol Guthrow from 1:30 to 2. And I will now turn it over to Leigh.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for coming. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I actually was on staff at Baltimore Clayworks years ago. I kind of grew up in the nonprofit administration world. After graduate school, I worked there for 9 years from 97 to 2006. So I'm thrilled to be back. I love Baltimore Clayworks. I've had my work there a few times, and I'm excited to have had the opportunity to jury this show, Garden Reverie, which is opening up on Saturday. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the towards the end. But I can just kind of dive into telling you a little bit about my journey in clay. I found clay actually in undergrad school at Hamilton. I was a sophomore, and I was a double major studio art and English literature. And one of my requirements was, this was a liberal arts school, not an art school. But one of my requirements was that I had to take either sculpture or ceramics. And honestly, I wasn't really that interested in either one of them. I had up till then had been focused on 2D art. So I tried to get into the sculpture class, and it was full. And so I actually ended up in the ceramics class. And I wasn't that excited about it, but I got to say that, like, literally in the first class, I was hooked. And I learned that I think in 3 dimensions. And so let me see if I can get this to move forward. Hold on. Okay, here we go. So once I took ceramics, I was hooked, like I said, and it was my focus. And when I was graduating from undergrad, I had to decide whether to pursue ceramics or English literature. And I was thinking about what kind of career I could have in either. And obviously there was not much of a career path for either one of those paths, for one of those majors. So I decided to pursue art, which was really my passion. And I went right away after graduating Hamilton to RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and was in the School for American Crafts at a time where there were no female teachers, which was kind of interesting. This was the early 90s. But I learned a lot from my professor, who was Rick Hirsch. And at the time when I came in, I was working in figurative sculpture. And in one of my critiques, my professor said, well, I want to challenge you with something. I want you to say what you've got to say without using the figure. Maybe try to do something abstract, and what would it look like if you took the figure out of it? And that led me to the library and to this book. I was already using metaphors of from nature in my figurative sculpture. And I found this book and it changed my work forever. But at the library, it was an oversized book and it was all in German. So all I had were images to work with, but that was enough. And years later, I found this book in English and I ordered it, and I'm happy to have it in my library right now. But as Rebecca mentioned, I use nature as a metaphor to talk about human condition. I have always been interested in plants and plant life as to talk about human sexuality and relationships. And what blew me away in that book, Secrets of Plant Life, was how images of the inside parts of plants looked like people parts, like plants have ovaries and they have a sex life and they have, and their parts mirror our parts. And so I kind of attached to that metaphor, and it has never lost its, like, I have never lost my interest in using nature as a metaphor to talk about human condition. I love that that plants pull you in and at the same time they repel you, and that they naturally have an ability to attract who they need to attract to reproduce, and they repel who they need to repel in order to thrive. And I think that we as humans and in relationships, have a lot of similarities. So these images really came into my world, and I just wanted to share some very old sculptures from my senior thesis, from my graduate thesis. So I call the show Secret Places, which is obviously an homage to that book I found. And these are large scale sculptures. This one was really kind of a fun discovery. There was this cherry tree or some tree outside our studio, and I picked a bunch of these little red berries and wrapped soft clay around them, and then just put them on my studio table. And then the next day when I came in, the clay had cracked around the berries, and it was this beautiful statement. And so I decided to try to replicate that in clay. So for this piece, I made little clay berries, I bisqued them, I glazed them, and then I wrapped wet clay around. I didn't glaze fire them, I just glazed them. I wrapped wet clay around the bisqued and glazed red berries, let them dry, bisqued again, and then glazed again. And what resulted were these pieces that are about this big around. I wonder where they are now. I haven't seen them in a really long time, but you can see that the clay did what it naturally does, and it revealed the hard parts in the inside as the clay shrunk. So this was a fun project, and really talked about the juxtaposition of the hard shell and the soft middle, but also the strength and resilience of what's inside. And I was really interested in that as a woman who was, in her early 20s, and, thinking about my sexuality, my gender, and also, leaving the parents' nest. And I was just and becoming an adult and having to think about my future and what I want for myself as a woman. And so these pieces are, I can't remember how many inches, but they're pretty big. And the surface I used was encaustic. So I wanted that satiny silky surface, and I couldn't find a glaze that would behave, and glaze chemistry wasn't my thing at the time. So I used a combination of underglazes and encaustic to get some of these surfaces. And for this one, the outer part, this was a 3-part sculpture. I was about, I don't know, about 32 inches tall. I also was inspired in, especially as a young person, by Georgia O'Keeffe, and how she would bring flowers, in large parts of flowers, and just like let us see things that we don't usually see with the naked eye. And I was really kind of bringing that too, by taking actual images of plant life, of microscopic parts, and then blowing them up to much larger size, and they become something else entirely. And these were huge. The one on the left was 76 inches wide. These, unfortunately, I had to take a hammer to before I came home from graduate school. But these, I was just playing around with the essential male and female forms. Very abstract. After I left graduate school, I continued to play with this idea of inside outside, and fertility, and the soft middle and the strong outside, and how they interact. And again, I was playing with materials, and in this case, these porcelain eggs on the inside, I wrapped around paper, and the paper burned out and left this really interesting insides. I also, this was very early 2000s, actually, did some smaller versions of just playing around with different forms, inspired by nature, but also referencing human parts and relationships. This was the home series. And I was using mostly just earth tones, and I wasn't using a lot of color at this time. And then I was working at Baltimore Clayworks at this time, and I was teaching. I was a tech and a teacher at Catonsville Community College, just right around 695 from you guys. And I had to teach a sculpture class, and one of the things I had to teach was welding, and I had never welded before. And the head of the department said, "I'll teach you. It's easy. I'll teach you. You'll be a step ahead of the students." And so that's what happened. And so I decided to learn by making myself a couple of bases, steel bases. And so this was my first steel base. It was steel plate cube, and then I had a rod going up the middle. And so I took my forms, and then I went vertical. And this kind of really changed my work forever as well. This piece, I remember, it was in what is now your shop in the middle, and someone bought it. I was so sad to see it leave, actually. I wish I knew where it was because I don't remember who bought it. But this was my first Pulse piece, and I called this series Pulse because I really feel like the parts in the vertical space have almost like a heartbeat, and even though they reference, kind of like animal, vegetable, mineral type things, I like to think of them as, as like really having human elements. So this piece, specifically really kind of represented the male figure, the father figure, the mother figure, and then the baby. So I'm just bringing those quintessential items, forms together. This was the other base that I made, and this was another iteration of that same idea. That egg form, this stands about, I guess, 4 feet tall, and that egg form has 2 little like metal rods on the underside of it, which insert into the tips of the center legs, I guess you could call them. And this was called a delicate balance. And that sits on my front porch. I'm glad to have that one. At the same time, I was making these forms, like I couldn't stop making these forms. And I would just, I just at first would make a pile of them. And I called these pieces gatherings, where I would just make all these organic pieces that bring different elements and colors together. And you can see I'm starting to play with color. And my like urge to make these forms kind of came at the same time when I was making these bases. And so from there started, you know, the Pulse series really kind of took off, and I started stacking these pieces and playing around with how the pieces sit on the rod, and how the colors work together, and how the pieces interact with one another, and how it can be one piece made up of small parts. And this was the first one that had as many pieces as this. And I just played with this this format for a long time, and I still use it actually. And at the time I was using a very groggy clay body. This is 420, standard 420. I think it was then. I think it still is now. And I loved playing with the texture of the clay and pulling the sand out when you scrape the clay body, and just having it look like you know, as a skin as opposed to a glazed surface. And I also played around with gloss and matte surfaces, as you can see in the picture on the right, where, you know, the little button, belly button type is glaze, and then the rest is matte underglaze type thing. And as you might recognize this space, this was a show at Baltimore Clayworks. I'm trying to think what year it was. It might have been like 2004 or 5 or something like that. I should have looked it up. But I switched to porcelain at this time. And at the same time, I had just had my first daughter, my first child. And with the birth of Carmen, a lot of color came into my life. When I was pregnant with Carmen, I was like, no pink. I don't want any pink or purple. No, nothing girly. And what happened was that, you know, Carmen was attracted to all of those girly things and colors at the time. And that entered my work, and also all of those Disney movies, just like in my face. Color came to my life in a very strong and powerful way. And it shows in my artwork. I mean, I really blame my daughters for the color. So I continued to play with this vertical format, sometimes being very narrative, like the piece on the left, and then other times really just playing with form, texture, and color. And you know, each one of these pieces had a different feeling and referenced something very specific for me, but I really left it open to the viewer to explore, and, you know, and see what they want to see in these pieces. I mean, I've heard everything from, oh, that looks like a sweet potato, to, you know, just something, you know, very personal. And I love that people see different things in these pieces. And then I also made some smaller pieces. These are probably like, you know, tabletop, probably 30 to 36 inches, while these other ones were almost 6 feet tall. I don't know if I referenced the size, but with the steel bases, the welded steel bases, I could really, really push the limits. And the size of the parts, you know, kind of determined the height of the pieces. I just couldn't stop making these. At the same time I was making those pieces, I was making these wall pieces. And this was like, also wanting to work off the floor and off the wall was kind of a solution to being a sculptor, and, hearing all the time, oh, I don't have space for that sculpture, so, well, if people have space for a painting, they have space for a wall sculpture. And there's always a little corner on the floor. So it was kind of a strategic decision to use the wall and use the floor, and to make vertical pieces that don't take up much space. I think it was lucky that these things happened. So with the wall gatherings, I made these ceramic shelves, and they became these pieces turned out to be quite narrative. Creating a stage for my parts, and then having parts interact with each other in a very specific way on a specific platform, told, allowed me to tell stories, even though they were still very abstract. They were stories of marriage and relationship and closeness and motherhood, and gender and family. And this one was called Brood. I had fun with these as well and made a lot of them. This one was called Wedge. This was kind of about experiencing having a young child and how they kind of take over your life and can sometimes be like a wedge in a marriage. From there, I started to explore these wall pieces even further and with even more color. This was the porcelain version of the wall gatherings. And then I had these steel shelves made, and was in this show, invited to this show in DC, and I had this huge wall to work with. And so I just started making all these little pieces, not really thinking about, how they would interact with one another. I just played with form and color and texture. And I was also incorporating wire, nichrome wire into the pieces. Like you see in this upper left, the blue piece, there's some little wire. I don't know if I have a detail. I don't think I have a detail of that one, but I showed the kin series, this kin wall series with my lure pieces. And I felt like they were kind of telling the same stories, but in a different format. And at this time, I was starting to get tired of making these pieces. And this was probably around 2006 or 7. I had been making them for 5 or 6 years. And then I went back to the library, and I started studying pollination. And I was really intrigued by the relationship between pollinators and plants, and how plants evolve to attract the pollinator they need to propagate, and the lengths to which plants would go to spread their pollen around. And I was just fascinated by this. And I also felt like it was an incredible metaphor about relationships, because the symbiotic relationship between, pollinators and plants was perfect to talk about human relationships. So I started to, put that into ceramics. Oh, and at the same time, I found this book called Pollen. And it was pollen pieces, pollen spores, magnified. And I was just floored by the incredible forms that pollen, the beautiful, beautiful forms. I don't have any more images to show you of pollen, but so that inspired these other wall pieces called botanical duets, and where I have two-part wall pieces, and with a pollen abstraction and a pollinator abstraction, and they hang in close proximity to each other to kind of create a tension. And then also I tried to kind of bring the color and texture somehow integrated to kind of represent how flowers and pollinate, how flowers would mimic their pollinator in order to attract them. Like there's this orchid that um, looks exactly like a specific bee that pollinates them, so that the bee would land on the flower, thinking that it was going to mate with another bee, and it would in the process pollinate the flower. I mean, that's like amazing. So I don't know. I think, while millions of years went into developing that relationship, I think it is a good example of the power of a good connection. So I played around with the botanical duets. I just like exhausted. I made like, I don't know how many pairs, just I lost count. I used to number them. I know I got way over 100. And then I lost track of all the numbers. So, and here's an example of them kind of arranged on a wall in an exhibition with some of the pulse pieces that I was doing at the time. And you'll see that my colors got a lot more vibrant, even more. This was probably right. My second child was born in 2005. So this was right around the time. So I had two small children, and I was working full time and somehow making exhibitions happen. Almost full time. I guess at that time I was working 3/4 time. I was moved up to New York in 2006. So that series, playing with the botanical duets and then isolating the pollinator and the plant parts led to the next series, which I call Lure. And for this series, I wanted to make a stacking piece that was more, it was like one form. So still using small parts that are added together. This was the first piece in that series, and my lure pieces all start with the word lure and then have another name in parentheses, which kind of references its inspiration. And I took inspiration straight from plant forms. So this piece was called Lure Titan, and it was inspired by a flower whose name I can't remember right now in Latin, but this is about 6 feet tall. I built it in sections, and like it's 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it has 6 parts altogether, and it's been in my front yard for about 10 years now. This is a cone 6 porcelain, and mostly underglaze, Amico velvet underglaze. You can see this texture here on the right, the red. That texture is made with little beads of clay that I added onto the surface with the end of a paintbrush. And once I started that texture, I loved it, but then I cursed myself because it meant many, many hours of attaching those little beads. But I was really happy with how it turned out. But what I was thinking with these pieces was that, this was the plant, and given its size, it's human sized. It turns us, the viewer, into the pollinator. And this was okay. So around 2007 or 8, I was making this. It was around 2006 and 7 I started making these pieces. Yeah, and then I had a few shows in 2008. The most fun experiment is putting them in a gallery or in a group show. These were at SOFA Chicago in 2008, actually, and watching how people interact, like how people either were drawn into them and noticed them, or they walked right by. And to me, that's the story of pollination, because my work is not for everyone. And people who were drawn to it would come close and they would want to touch it. And I just loved that that mirrored what happens in nature. These pieces were, this was at, well, that was, so I'm just showing you some different variations. And then I was also playing on the wall at the time. Some of these pieces you probably saw, there was, if you came to a show at Baltimore Clayworks, it was in 2012 or 11, something like that. I had a solo show at Baltimore Clayworks and had to make a ton of work. It was called Apiary. And if you know what an apiary is, it's a place where bees live, honeybees. And so I had all of these pieces in this lure series. And there at Baltimore Clare, I'll tell you more about, but I also had these pieces at a botanical garden in I think it was 2000. I can't remember what year. It was in Providence, whenever the NCECA was in Providence, Rhode Island. But having pieces inside a botanical garden like this really, we'll come back to that. It was really inspiring for me to see my work in an outdoor space like that. And led to my current work, actually. This one's called Lure Digitalis. It was inspired by foxgloves, but it's kind of like obviously different from foxgloves. Oh, this was another picture from the apiary show. So in the back corner of the gallery, the final room, and I wanted to have these poppy forms all over the wall. Like I really wanted to have every surface of the wall have these poppy flowers. Do I have a detail? Here's the detail. But I determined that I would need like 1,000 of them in order to fill every corner. So I did an arrangement, and I had more like 400. So the wall was just under half covered. But what I wanted to capture in this room was like, and I used kind of like the outline of the gallery. Like, you know how when you're in another place and you turn a corner of a trail or a road, and all of a sudden there's like a field of poppies or wildflowers, and it's like a burst of color. That was what I was trying to emulate in this room, was that you just kind of like, you leave the one room and then you turn the corner and it's like this amazing installation burst of color. I had to actually have an intern help me make all these pieces because it was quite a feat getting these pieces all done. You'll see these pieces later because I had turned them into outdoor pieces. And also in the gallery at Baltimore Clare, in the front, was this kind of this swarm of bees, or abstracted bees. And that was the only place where you saw the bees. So I liked the idea that they were in the front as you walked in, but then you as the viewer were the pollinator that would walk through the apiary or the garden. I also had some wall pieces in that show, and I still make these botanical. I call them botanicals. So once after the botanical duets, I started just making the botanicals on their own as single pieces. And the one on the left is 18 inches wide. So that was the largest one I made. And then the others are more like 6 inches, like the one on the right. And actually for both of these, the forms that were attached to my form were wheel thrown. I only wheel throw parts if it's the faster way to make them. And then these spiky botanicals, I don't know, I've made so many of those over the years. But I had a lot of fun making these botanicals, I gotta say. Like, that's also then it's less of a narrative, but they are fun to have in spaces. In 2019, I had just left my executive director job at Clay Art Center up here in Portchester, up here in Westchester. And all of a sudden had time to be in my studio again. The previous 6 years, I became executive director in 2012. And for the 6 years I was executive director, like I barely made anything. I was full time, fully full time. And if I made anything in the studio, it was real small. So when I left there, um, I all of a sudden had time to be in the studio. And what I ended up wanting to make is work for the garden. So I took that like seed of an idea that came from that show at the Botanical Center in Providence, Rhode Island, and in seeing my work in outdoor spaces. And then I decided to make a line of work that, could, that people, of work that people could, easily purchase to bring in their gardens. So I also took another welding class because I needed to relearn it. And I went to a BOCES class and taught myself how to weld again. And I made these steel stakes that stake into the ground and then curve up. And then these ceramic parts slide down the rod. And they can live outside year round. I call them garden dwellers. And just like all the rest of the series that I've done, I just make them again and again, and each one of a kind and different from each other. And I also decided that the only way to get these out to the world was to do craft shows. So I started, oh, and this was also like COVID hit. And just as I was about to do my first craft show up here, Crafts at Lyndhurst, COVID hit and everything was canceled. Um, so I had all of this work and no way to get it to people. And to I decided to start my own craft art show outside here in Westchester County. So, oh, and you see those red poppies in the garden? Like I took the poppies that were in that wall installation at Baltimore Clay Works. I had shown them a number of times on the wall and I had sold a few of them separately. And then I repurposed them for outside. And so I still have some left that I use to make garden installations. And what I was saying was I started up my own craft show called the Westchester Craft Crawl with a couple of other artists that are up here. And we invited artists from all craft media, and we had it at different, it was more than one stop. So I had a stop on my street and in my studio, and I had about a few artists on my block. And then we had a few other stops within 5 miles of each other. And these are my newer garden dweller pieces that I've been making. And we're still doing the craft crawl. We were doing it twice a year. And now we are doing it once a year. But it was a great way to get people out of their houses and outdoors. And it was all socially distanced. The first, year, the first one we did was the fall of 2020. And then we did one in the spring and fall for the following years. And this was my backyard. This is my studio space. So I like basically set up my garden, and I didn't talk to you about the fact that I made these bird baths. So you'll notice like I brought back the Pulse series that I had been doing and then kind of turned that into a bird bath. So I've been having fun making work for outdoor spaces and and it was, I think COVID really enhanced that because everybody was investing in outdoor spaces so that they could socialize with people and be outdoors while we were getting rid of COVID. And so that's what I've been doing. And I've also played around with making some garden pots, but I did quite a few craft shows the last 4 years, but I've also just recently taken a break from doing that. Because once again, I'm tired of doing those things. So I'm trying to figure out what my next thing is. So here's a couple of shots. Like that's my street. across the one on the right is across the street from me. So I had the neighborhood involved, and we had all different kinds of art, craft artists, and the one on the left was another stop up in Peekskill. And this was this one woman's backyard. She had an incredible backyard. And it was just a wonderful community event, and it's still, we're still having fun with it. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Garden Reverie before we open it up for questions. Yoshi asked me if I would do this, you know, jury a show for Baltimore Clayworks, and of course I can't say no to Baltimore Clayworks when they ask me something. And it made sense for me to do something related to botanicals in the garden. So I decided to put together a premise where we see what comes in, with the premise of like drawing inspiration from the garden. It's specifically. And what I like about using the garden specifically was that, gardens over millennia are basically tamed like wild nature, and so I love the idea of this space as being a combination of the wild, but also something that is tamed and almost domesticated. And I like the dichotomy when people design gardens, of how they play around with that. And I love this quote by D.H. Lawrence: "Brute force crushes many plants, yet the plants rise again. The pyramids will not last a moment compared with the daisy." And I love that metaphor of something as fragile as a daisy that we see as this fleeting thing. It's because of how they've evolved that they are still around, and that they propagate, and how smart plants are, that they still exist despite everything that we do to this planet. Yoshi told me I could invite a handful of artists, so I just wanted to share with you who I invited. And if you're coming to the opening on Saturday, you'll see their pieces among the artists that were juried in. So I think there's like 60 artists in all, something like that. Yoshi can correct me. But it was so challenging to choose. It was really great. It was really a great body of works that that applied. So it's going to be a great show. So Erin Furminski, I don't have images of what's in the show. I just kind of picked an example, but I love how she is a good example of how we tame nature, and how we confine nature, like this, these natural objects they're almost domesticated. And she plays around with that. And then there's Paul Briggs, who through his pinched forms really kind of lets the materiality of clay come through, but also I love how he says nature makes no aesthetic mistakes. And that people look at his pieces, his pinch form pieces, and sees like leaves or tentacles or a cobra head, and people see what they want. And I love how that, kind of brings up this idea that nature repeats itself. A lot of people see in my botanical pieces like underwater creatures, and I'm like, yes, absolutely. You look at underwater creatures, and they look a lot like flowers, like exotic flowers. And I love that animal and vegetable often mix in when we look at things from nature. Brenda Quinn is one of my favorite potters, who actually lives not even a half mile from my house. And she has been making these beautiful functional objects. She's an amazing gardener as well. And her garden is incredible. She has like just about every vegetable and fruit tree that you can imagine. And she's got a green thumb, and she draws inspiration from her garden. And the difference between her and me is that she's able to grow things with real intention. I can grow things, but I would not consider myself a gardener. but she pulls that, the kind of the beauty of the garden into these controlled spaces, but also the individuality of the pieces really come through as well. Janice Jakelski is somebody that I discovered because Ceramics Monthly asked me to write an article on their work, and I had never seen their work before. I was just floored when I saw their work. And she really approaches her work with all this digital technology, and but draws a lot of inspiration from historical ceramics, but also the garden and flowers, and how we contain the garden and bring flowers into our world using objects like vases and things. And she's also playing with fragility, obviously. And what she says here, the gap between the object and the viewer. Really fun, incredible work. I heard that her first piece that she sent broke in transit, which is heartbreaking, but that she sent a replacement. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm excited to see it. Carol Guthrow is a sculptor who abstracts nature, and she also plays around with botanical forms and plant and flower forms and turns them into something else. This is a sweet little piece that's in the show. And I just love her work, and she's got a brilliant sense of color and form and negative space, and she's somebody to keep an eye on. Also Rain Harris. I started a show at Clay Art Center when I was there called 6x6 Transformations or something like that. And it was a tile show. And it was all the artists had to send 6x6 tiles. And I invited Rain to that first one, and she emailed me and said, can my tile be round? I said, of course. And she started making these wall pieces. And this was back in, I don't know. It's like, I want to say like 2006, or I think it was 2006 or 7 that first 6x6 show was. And she sent a very similar piece to this floral arrangement, like tile 6x6, and she's still making them. And she's taken that wall form and just really developed her process, and she's making beautiful wall pieces. And she also makes incredible sculpture that has this resin, and I just love how she uses the garden as to talk about what she calls still lifes that question artificiality and preciousness. I think it's wonderful. I love that they're all this black ceramic. And this is my piece that will be in the show. I decided to play around with my base, and instead of just having one rod up the middle, I put 6, and so it's almost like an arrangement. So this piece will be in the gallery. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah.